Mind Your Farm Business on realagriculture.com is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank.
Welcome to the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. I'm Shaun Haney, founder of realagriculture.com and host of Real Ag Radio on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. You can find more episodes of this podcast by going to mindyourfarmbusiness.com. Today's topic on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast is all about avoiding burnout, the Burnout Gamble. As entrepreneurs, farmers and ranchers tend to work as hard as required to get things done that need to get done. In the last episode of Mind Your Farm Business, we talked about time management. Well, what can happen if you don't follow some of the principles as outlined by Chris Croft, our previous guest? You can suffer from burnout. Just a hint, burnout can create real problems for you and your health, not just personally, but also in your business in the short and long term. Burnout is a real thing that business leaders around the world have to contend and deal with. Today's guest is Hamza Khan. Hamza Khan is a multi-award-winning marketer, best-selling author, and global keynote speaker whose TED Talk X talk, Stop Managing, Start Leading, has been viewed over 1 million times. He shares actionable insights on resilience, productivity, and leadership to help people and organizations thrive in the future of work. Through his consulting, writing, teaching, and speaking, Khan empowers people and businesses to transform ideas into action. From New York to Singapore, from Los Angeles to Sydney, Khan is a global thought leader who has spoken to hundreds of audiences across many industries in numerous countries. His clients have included some of the world's most dynamic companies and organizations, including PepsiCo, LinkedIn, Deloitte, PwC, Trivago, and over 100 colleges. He's also the author of Amazon bestseller, The Burnout Gamble. Achieve more by beating burnout and building resilience. Here's my conversation with Hamza Khan. Hamza, how are you doing today?
Shaun, I am doing very, very well. Thank you. And yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing fantastic, doing great. So today we're going to focus in on a topic that a lot of entrepreneurs can, kind of ignore and push aside because they don't recognize a lot of the sort of the telltale signs, so to speak. We're going to talk about burnout. And from your perspective, I know you speak to audiences all over the place. How do you define burnout?
So that's a really, really good question. I love the way that you framed that entrepreneurs might not recognize it. And I hope we come back to that in a second. So burnout, the definition has been articulated clearly by the WHO, and they only reclassified burnout as early, as 2019. Even though the term burnout has been around since the 70s, in 2019, I feel like we finally have consensus. And the WHO now defines it as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And they ascribe 3 dimensions to burnout. So the first being feelings of energy depletion, the second being increased mental distance from one's job, and the third being reduced professional efficacy. So again, it's localized within the workplace. And occupational burnout is defined as, chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed and described by those 3 dimensions that I just shared with you.
Are there typical signs that one would try to pick up on that would identify that, maybe I am suffering from some of this burnout?
Yeah, absolutely. And it would be helpful to think about these signs as divided into 3 layers: the emotional, the physical, and the mental. So for example, in the emotional layer, you would have feelings of loneliness or wanting to give up or not feeling connected to your work. Those are common symptoms, if you will. Physical symptoms would be fatigue, tiredness, lowered immunity, changes in your appetite, et cetera. And then on the mental side of things, Shaun, you would have anxiety and inability to focus, symptoms of depression, so on and so forth. And I think the mistake that a lot of people make, and especially entrepreneurs make, when they're pushing through days when self-care is absolutely needed, when their health and wellness is at stake, is they tend to identify, or rather misidentify, these individual symptoms as just that, individual symptoms that are disconnected, that are unrelated to any other things going on in their life, when in fact they are part of this collection of symptoms that it feeds into the definition that I shared earlier, burnout syndrome.
Yeah, so I think of some of the marketing of this. I think of like Bill Gates when he started Microsoft. The stories about him basically working for like 4 days straight without sleeping, and those kinds of things. So some of this stuff is kind of entrenched in how we view what the entrepreneur's life is like. You mentioned pushing through. There's a lot of hours. So how do you balance all of that?
It's so interesting. You used the example of Bill Gates. I mean, that ethos has certainly carried over into the early stages, and there's some remnants now, even in sort of especially within the tech entrepreneurial space over there as well. And I certainly succumbed to that early in my career. I think in 2014 was the last time that I experienced crushing occupational burnout. And if you go on my Instagram and you look at some of the posts that I shared in 2014, Shaun, they were absolutely ridiculous. I was posting things like, push hard, I'll sleep when I die. And my favorite one was the beard never retires. And I'm like, wow, when I look back at that, I cringe, first of all. But I also think that that's symptomatic of this, toxic hustle culture that existed in the early 2000s, 2010s, if you will. The second part of that, Shaun, that you asked, like, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with those external messages? This is a really tough thing that I think even I struggle with sometimes too, which is defining what enough means. And I don't think people are good at doing that. Organizations are not good at doing that. Organizations have a way that they do that by clearly identifying objectives and key results and targets and goals. But at the individual level, it can be really challenging to define what enough is for us. I mean, any given day, people don't feel like they're perfect enough, efficient enough, progressive enough, satisfied enough, innovative enough. And that leads them to fall down the 12 stages of burnout and experience occupational burnout because they overcompensate for their lack of intrinsic belief that they are enough.
But the reality is that for the entrepreneur, depending on what industry you're in, there's some pretty time-sensitive work. And I think of, for this audience, agriculture, you think about seeding and planting time or harvest time. You're up against Mother Nature. There's only so many, you only have so many days to get things completed in the appropriate manner. You can't just quit at 6 because you read a book or you heard a speaker say you need to relax. You need to take some time for yourself. Harvest is not the time to do that.
No, not at all. And sometimes there's a thing that you got to do in order to get to do the thing that you want to do. And research out of Stanford University has found that reframing something that seems stressful as something that produces good stress instead of bad stress is enough to change your physical response to it. And this is actually in a great book by Dr. Kelly McGonigal called The Upside of Stress. So I think about this all the time too. Thinking about this specific audience over here, you're right. There are specific times when their workload is heavy, when their work flow or their work style is reactive, and it can be really intense, really stressful. I totally understand that. And in the preparation for my talk at the recent Grow Canada conference and afterwards, and speaking with many of the growers in the audience, I truly came to appreciate that and understand that there's so much that is outside of their control. But I think what was common across all the people that I spoke with, and a message that seems to have resonated with, is that the work that they do, the work that this audience does of this podcast, the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, the work that they do is as essential as it gets. And reframing this stress of the cyclical nature of the work and the times when it gets really intense, reframing it as something that is essential, that is supporting Canada's emergence from chaos and sustenance, the very life force of Canada, if you will. That could be enough potentially to change how, as individuals, they engage with those stressors.
Now, you mentioned the 12 stages of burnout. Do you want to hit on some of those?
Yeah, and this is really interesting. And I have to preface this by saying that typically people go through these 12 stages in sequence, but you can actually skip steps. So it typically starts with the compulsion to prove oneself. And that goes back to my definition of enough, or rather the problem of defining what enough is. When you don't define what enough is for you, then you feel this compulsion to prove yourself and prove that you are the best at what you're doing and make it known that you can deal with difficult things. And that's not bad in and of itself, but one that leads to working harder, then neglecting your needs and displacing conflicts. Those are the first 4 stages of burnout. That's when things start to get slippery. The 5th stage is a revision of values. The 6th is denial of emerging problems. The seventh stage, if I remember correctly, is withdrawing. The eighth stage is odd behavioral changes. Then comes depersonalization, which is antagonizing others and just becoming a real toxic person to be around. Then 10, the last three stages, starting with stage 10, inner emptiness. Stage 11 would be depression. And then stage 12, Shaun, is full-blown burnout syndrome. And this is total mental, physical, and emotional collapse. Now, you can, again, skip stages. So even if you are not experiencing burnout right now, all it takes is one life transition. For instance, there's another burnout inventory, or rather a stress inventory called the Hamza Khan Stress Index that gives a numeric value to different transitions that a person might go through. So the most stressful thing a person can go through in their life, according to this index, is the death of a spouse, which gives you a score of 100. And then the least stressful thing on this index is minor violations of the law. That would be like a parking ticket or something. And then right on top of that, and that has a score of 11, by the way. Right on top of that is Christmas, believe it or not, which has a score of 12. So heads up for all of the listeners, if you're listening to this while the holidays are happening, because at the time of this recording, we're approaching the holidays. Just know that simply attending a Christmas party or planning a Christmas party is going to produce stress. And that's helpful to know, because if in a calendar year you rack up more than 300 points, according to this Hamza Khan stress scale, then you are at severe risk of injury or worse, fatality. And all of these things have a direct impact on burnout. When we're talking about burnout, what we're really talking about is the underlying problem, which is stress.
Yeah. And for some people, once you identify that and you think, oh man, I'm on this track, I need to do something about it. There's positive ways to cope and there's negative ways to cope. Some of this comes down to decision. Some of this comes down to going down a track that you really had no intention of ever going down. Let's talk about some of the different coping ways that positive and negative.
Yeah, so the negative coping ways, and I'm speaking again as somebody who has tried these things, and they never work, right? They just exacerbate the problem. They just produce more stress. I think the worst thing that you can do when you're experiencing burnout is continue to work harder, to put in more hours. And that's something that I struggled with earlier in my career as an overachiever. I thought that if I just rolled up my sleeves and just put in more hours, worked harder, increased the level of intensity, that I would be okay. But then that resulted in me having a full-blown panic attack at the end of 2014. So that would be, one way to not cope with this. Another way that you see, and sometimes a lot of this is outside of our control, because by the time we realize we're burning out, it's already far too late. By the time we become self-aware, it's already far too late. So when, if you find yourself in situations where your family or friends are commenting, or even coworkers are commenting on your changing behavior, according to that 12-stage model, you're already in the latter stages. So if you find yourself drinking more, you find yourself smoking more, you're feeling lethargic, or things about your day-to-day are changing in dramatic ways. They might seem like coping mechanisms, but they might actually be just symptoms of even further burnout. The best thing that you can do, starting with these three steps, would be to focus on reducing two variables when it comes to burnout: the frequency of stressful events in your life and the impact that stress can have on you. So those are the two variables that need to be controlled, because when the frequency of stressful events in your life is high and the impact of stress on your life is high, then you're at extreme risk of burnout. And that's where I found myself back in 2014, where a lot of people are finding themselves, unfortunately, here at the time of this recording, 2 years into the pandemic. So focus on reducing those two variables. And there's specific things that you can do to manage those two variables.
Is it common, Hamza, for people to not find some self-accountability in this, in the sense where the grass is always greener, where it's my job that's creating the stress, it's the industry I'm working in that's creating the stress, it's my boss, maybe it's the people I'm working with. If I just change some of those things, it's all going to be better. When you get down to it and you really dive deep, some of this is actually you.
Oh, Shaun, I couldn't have articulated that better. This is a multi-pronged challenge. When we talk about burnout, yes, a lot of my research right now and a lot of the speaking that I do is about the system-level influencers of burnout, namely, 6 upstream predictors that exist in the workplace that are mostly within the control of leadership. But at the same time, I began this journey into understanding burnout from an individual perspective, because I worked in a workplace environment where, I would describe it as almost utopic, in that all of the supports were there. My leaders were good. I had great coworkers. Everything was working well, but I was fundamentally the problem. So you're absolutely right that there are some things, many things, and much accountability rests with the individual. And there's two parts that I want to just tease out over here. So the first is, coming back to the systems level. Dr. Christina Maslach, one of the pioneers of burnout research, had this great quote about how the workplace influences burnout. And she said that, I'm paraphrasing over here, but she said that no matter how beautiful the plant was to begin with, if it's in lousy soil, if it's not watered enough, if it's not getting enough sunlight, no matter how beautiful it was to begin with, it's not going to thrive. And I think that's absolutely true. But at the same time, the plant in question over here, the individual, also has to strive, also has to be disciplined in its approach to work, also has to do the deep reflection about what is enough for them, and understand that they are part of this larger ecosystem and they have to do the work individually as well. So you're absolutely right, Shaun. I mean, this is a responsibility that needs to be shared by the individual and by the system alike.
We'll get back to the rest of the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, but first a word from our sponsor, RBC Royal Bank.
This episode of Mind Your Farm Business podcast is brought to you by RBC. As an agricultural producer, you're putting a lot of thought into your operation every day. You probably have more than a couple of ideas on how to handle challenges, like market fluctuations, unexpected weather, or simply weighing the pros and cons of adopting new technology. But knowing where to start? That's where a solid risk management strategy can help. Visit rbc.com/risk management to learn more.
I was just kind of smirking here, listening or thinking about some of the quick fixes that people chase as well, right? The 4 or 5 hour work week, or the 4-day work week, or right? Like these kind of, if you just did these 5 things, like getting up at 4 in the morning, like that kind of stuff, that can be an elusive chase as well.
Oh, absolutely. And so I alluded to it earlier. My graduate research right now is about understanding and the system level determinants of burnout. And what we've looked at some key performance indicators over the last 10 years. We've looked at growth in the pharmaceutical industry, growth in the wellness industry, growth in the fitness industry, growth in, a whole bunch of industries that would suggest that there are solutions in the market for beating burnout, for reducing stress. And, over the last 10 years, we've seen exponential growth across all of these key performance indicators. But the levels of stress and burnout haven't decreased. And so we're trying to understand why, even though there are individual solutions, or the market seems to be saturated with individual solutions, why we still haven't been able to reduce levels of burnout and stress. And that's why I'm focused right now on the systems level determinants. But like I said, I began my foray into this world from an individual perspective. And time and again, I come across people just like myself who, if all of the things are true in their life, are still experiencing stress and burnout. If we've isolated all of the systems level issues, then what can you do as the individual? And that's my question to many people who are still struggling in workplaces that are very supportive.
Yet, even though, as you talked about, there is some personal choices and there's some personal things that you can do to help yourself in the balancing out stress that doesn't lead to burnout. We're hearing more and more about governments that are thinking about managing this for people. And I believe it's Ontario that's talking about how, as an employer, you can't send an email to an employee after 5 o'clock and things like that to help people manage stress and burnout.
Yeah.
Is all of that more, once again, just sort of like the trying to more, I guess, marketing of dealing with this than actually dealing with it?
It does feel like a bit of an overcorrection to me. And I think they're drawing a lot of inspiration from examples that they're seeing in Europe, for instance, where they've outlawed or they've made it illegal to send emails to your employees after a certain day, or after a certain time rather, where they've shrunk the work week. But we're not looking at this with the nuance that's necessary, because you can shrink the work week, but if you're not shrinking the workload, if you're not allocating enough resources to support the individual in the work that they're doing, then those fixes, like you said, Shaun, are just marketing. I think they're being used very strategically during times of elections to virtue signal, in a sense, that they are pro-worker, that they are pro-employee. But we have to ask the bigger questions about, has the work been clearly defined? Do people know exactly what their targets are, what their timelines are? Are there goals specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely? Are they SMART goals? If we start with that and then provide them with sufficient resources, financial and human resources to support that work, then arguably burnout should be non-existent in those workplace settings, or at least we've mitigated the systems level reasons why burnout might happen to the individuals downstream. So I do agree that some of this is feeling a bit disingenuous. It is feeling like a quick fix. It is feeling like marketing.
Yeah, not getting to the root of the problem.
We're not getting to the root of the problem.
Yeah,
and this is again the hardest thing when it comes to the work that I do over here, which is convincing people and organizations to define what the word enough means. And that's specifically very hard to do when you have, in my industry, in the knowledge work industry, it's quite hard to do at times. But I had some really, really great conversations with members of the Grow Conference, attendee network, and also the organizers that defining what enough is within the realm of the ag industry is actually, I don't want to say it's easier to do, but there are very tangible aspects to the work that's done in the ag industry. And I think there's a lot of lessons that all industries can learn from the ag industry when it comes to defining what enough is.
Do you think that farmers and ranchers are more prone to burnout? And I want to provide some context here, okay? They frequently work by themselves, so they're alone.
Right.
There is a huge mix between family and work. They're doing a lot of different roles as the entrepreneur on that farm. There's a huge amount on their shoulders. Are they more prone to burnout?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. And in fact, I was just listening to another one of your episodes on the podcast, and I think there was a stat, something like 68% of farmers as a group are more likely than the general population to experience chronic stress. Completely agree with that for all of the reasons that you mentioned and more. And especially during the pandemic, my goodness, I mean, all of the focus for essential work has been placed on the healthcare industry, but very little attention has been given to the people who quite literally feed the country. And, I think that has been something that has been troubling me since my experience with Grow Canada and speaking to the growers over there, speaking to the attendees, realizing that this is a group that has been going through it. For all the reasons you mentioned and more, let's talk about supply chain, for instance. Let's just talk about competition, feelings of alienation, some of the messages in society that are toxic, like you alluded to earlier with the Bill Gates saying that he's going to put in all of these excessive hours, technology, loneliness, and the uncertain economy. There's just so much about our world right now that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and I think that is being felt profoundly by growers.
Yeah, this whole thing is just so fascinating to me, and we mentioned the Gates example earlier. I think I'm a huge college football fan, and coaching is a profession where you hear a lot. He really loves the grind, and so I personally use that a lot too. Where there are certain times where you have to really appreciate the grind of the job. Now,
totally,
that is meant in a positive light, and the criteria it takes for somebody to do a certain job, no different than a dairy farmer. You have to appreciate the grind of getting up at 2, 3, 4 in the morning to milk those cows every day. So Hamza, how do you make sure that stays that whole grind stays positive and doesn't slip into the burnout category where the grind is turned into where you are just ground up?
That's an excellent question. I love that example because I too have used that phrase. I'm in love with the hustle. I'm in love with the grind. Yeah. The only challenge with me was that, the hustle and the grind didn't love me back. And that was tough because when I realized that it was insatiable, the hustle and the grind just wanted more of my output, wanted more of my time, wanted more of my energy, wanted more of my attention. And I wasn't getting the sufficient reward that I wanted from that. That was something that I had to do the deep sort of inner work to think about, do I love myself as much as I love the hustle and the grind? And so I had to assemble boundaries for my life. I had to know when work ended and when my life began, or how to blend them together. And I talked about this actually at the conference. I talked about setting up the dash method to know when to stop working. And, it could be time-based. So, thinking about this industry specifically, you could stop working at a certain time, perhaps when the sun goes down, whatever the case may be. It could also be unit-based. So today I'm going to, take care of this many sections of my farm or my ranch, or, in this day we have to milk X number of cows. So that's a unit-based dash. There could also be the energy-based dash, which is, working until you're actually out of energy when you're spent. It could be results-based. We're going to stop working when all of this is done, when we've achieved a certain objective. Or it could be feeling-based. Some days you just wake up and you think that I can only do so much today, and I'm going to stop working when I feel like I have satisfaction that enough work got done. I think it's really important to define before work starts how work is going to end, because when you do that, then you activate what's known as Parkinson's law. That's the most powerful of productivity laws I've found, which is work expands so as to fill the time allocated for its completion. So coming back to that phrase of, I love the hustle, I love the grind, but does it love me back? Again, if you don't define what's enough, if you don't simulate constraints, you're probably going to end up working tirelessly, because you can work ad infinitum if your body will allow for it. So just be very careful and set up those boundaries for yourself, and prevent yourself from relapsing into patterns of exhaustion that led to burnout in the first place.
Hamza, really appreciate this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast.
Shaun, absolute honor. Thank you so much for having me.
I found this whole topic of the burnout gamble to be quite interesting. As entrepreneurs, we are driving ourselves to make success in our business. This comes with the greatest of achievements, but if not managed properly, can lead to issues like burnout and the consequences that it enables. This is an ebb and flow that many of us can identify with as we feel the pressure to succeed in business and with our families. I hope that you've enjoyed today's discussion. If you have any feedback or comments on today's topic, please email me at shaney@realagriculture.com or call the Real Ag Listener line at 855-776-6147. You can find more episodes of Mind Your Farm Business Podcast at mindyourfarmbusiness.com or wherever you download your podcasts. Thanks to RBC Royal Bank, and until next time, keep on minding your farm business.